So we are very, very excited to have Martin here today. He is a champion for design thinking. This is a condensed version of a design thinking session which Martin offers, which there may be opportunity in the near future, perhaps in moving into sort of the autumn term, to really get stuck in on a very interactive version of this. But today really kind of looking at those fundamentals. So Martin, are you on the line and ready to go?
Certainly am.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us. In a moment, I will just stop my screen share and to allow you to set up.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, lovely.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me. Long-term partners of Enactus. So this is, I think, the 4th or 5th time that we've actually had a thing around design thinking, which has actually been quite an interesting topic for dealing with Enactus groups. One of the reasons why we in the software industry and the IT industry more generally use design thinking is primarily because design thinking is a way of engaging with a problem in a way that has some degree of formality toward reaching a solution, but at the same time tries not to sort of bring down the level of creativity. If there is something which really resonates with young people at universities that I do with on a regular basis, it's the idea that you've got more than one solution to any problem. And design thinking really is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to have a sort of fairly broad approach where you can try and encompass a whole series of different ideas and then have a narrowing of focus so that you end up creating a solution which has encompassed a lot of input from a lot of people. Within SAP is a business software company. So our clients are primarily business users. And in design thinking sessions that we've done in the past, and certainly, as Claire's just said, with dealing with potentially doing a design thinking session for you guys coming in the autumn, I'll be more than happy to do that. Is that design thinking sessions tend to be fairly iterative and engaging, but obviously with the time constraints today, I've had to sort of condense it down and do it more as a presentational style. However, if later on in the year you want to have a design thinking session where we can go through the proper process, that would tend to be more of a sort of very kind of Silicon Valley-esque setup, whereby I create a design thinking session where I actually ask you to work through a series of challenges. And as a result, you would be able to pick the topics from your Enactus businesses or entities and work through the specific problems around the things that you are dealing with on a sort of day-to-day basis through your Enactus products. By default, today, obviously, I can't do that because we've got limited time. So what I've done instead is I've turned it into a presentation about general design thinking principles. And I think you'll enjoy it. Design thinking has many different formats. So what we at SAP do is we tend to focus specifically on a design thinking process which was formulated by the D School. The D School is basically a design school at Stanford University. Stanford University obviously is in the heart of Silicon Valley, so it has a lot of engagements with the big players in the IT industry. And the D School is a way of bringing together lots of different skills to try and solve a problem by bringing in lots of different perspectives and technical abilities so that you're not constrained by having one particular model of thinking. So the D School, for example, doesn't just have designers, it doesn't just have artists and people who might do things like product design. It'll bring in mathematicians because they're really good at doing things like algorithms. You'd have process designers, people who are really good at investigating and analyzing particular business concepts. It might have people that are specialists in particular parts of industry or parts of the economy. So you might, for example, at the moment, for obvious reasons, have somebody who's a medical practitioner. So there's lots of different ranges of skills that you would try to bring into a design thinking process. But there are effectively 5 different components to design thinking. And the idea is that you start off with a fairly broad, large base of the pyramid, and you gradually narrow down the solution to the particular problem that you're looking at by basically having a process which gets narrower and narrower and narrower the further along you go, to the point you get to prototyping and testing, where you're actually testing one specific thing that you built, an idea that you've generated. But you've got 5 stages. The first is empathy, to generate empathy for the group that you're actually talking about. Defining is basically trying to take that person and to understand them in depth. So you would actually build a persona around an individual, effectively a fake individual, somebody that you can understand them in greater depth. Ideation is basically trying to have as many ideas as possible from as many people as possible, to try and bring in all those ideas as to give you a sort of tapestry of potential solutions to a problem. The prototyping stage is where you're actually trying to take all of those ideas and condense them down into one thing that you could actually build. By building, it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical product, it could be a service or something. And there's the testing phase, and testing is basically taking it into the market and basically trying to get a number of responses to the prototype, so that you can reiterate and change aspects that you know work less better or less well than others, and trying to improve the things that you think don't work, or at the same time being aware of things that may work better than you had anticipated. So it's kind of, that's the way. It's almost like a loop. Okay. The very first thing that you need to do when you're dealing with any solution to any problem is to have a sort of deep empathy. It's interesting, when I just came in on the slides at the end of the former speaker mentioning empathy there. It's one thing which the best designers do really, really well. You notice that sometimes having greater empathy for the person that you're dealing with is far more powerful than having what you might consider to be traditional market research. By which I mean, there have been a lot of products which have been put out into the marketplace which weren't necessarily what a person would have said they wanted, because the questions were written in such a way as to get a certain answer. And perhaps because the person that you were talking to, the potential customer or user, wouldn't have expertise necessary to make an evaluation of the thing that you were building. And as a result, you can end up with certain products which are very, very successful once they're actually made available to people, but which wouldn't have been the thing which would be the obvious solution. Okay, so there's a very famous quote by Henry Ford, for example. It basically said that if I had asked people what they wanted at the back end of the 19th century to improve their transportation, they would have said a faster horse, or a faster horse that didn't eat as much. There's no way that it would have said the motor car, because they weren't aware of the concept of the car. So being able to empathize with somebody enables you to have a sort of deeper understanding of what it is that they're actually trying to solve. What are the problems that they're facing in their everyday life, rather than basically just treating them as an end user. To give you some ideas of when this does and does not work, I've got a few examples here. If anybody knows what car this is, it's called a Mini. It's a car from the 1960s. Obviously, there are much more modern versions of it driving around now. Back then, it was considered a design classic. It still is considered a design classic. But it was considered a classic because even though the person who designed it designed a car which was very first of its type, nobody had created a car which was so low on the road. It was very, very fast. It was very roomy inside. It had lots of characteristics that weren't around for smaller cars at the time. But it turned out it was perfect for the group of people that it was aiming at. It was deliberately made to be cheap. It was deliberately made to have a great deal of room so that you'd be able to get lots of people inside it. So that basically people that were on a budget that wanted to have a sort of fast and reliable car could have access to it. However, if you don't have proper empathy, if you don't really understand the customer that you're actually pitching to, the fact that you're developing a quote unquote small car means that you can come up with other ideas. Here's another idea which perhaps wasn't quite so successful. For example, this is the Reliant Robin, which is literally a joke car. It was unbelievably made as a sort of competitor to the Mini, and it's awful for lots of different reasons. The first of which, of course, is the fact that it has only one wheel at the front. And so it was constantly falling over, literally. If you've ever seen the TV series Mr. Bean, Mr. Bean drives a Mini, and his nemesis, who you never see, drives one of these, and it's constantly falling over. So the person who designed this car clearly didn't have a great deal of empathy for their end user. They basically designed something which was designed around perhaps engineering concepts that they were interested in. Perhaps it was that they were interested in some new technology. Perhaps they were just in love with the idea of having a three-wheel car and they wanted to see if it would work. But clearly they didn't have the end user in mind. This one is even worse. It's a car which was famous from the mid 1980s, called the C5. Supposedly the future of transport for individuals. And it's a classic case of what happens when you don't have very much empathy, you don't have very much understanding for the customer, and you're just in love with the technology. So the person who developed this basically wanted to build, they were from the computer industry, they were in love with electrical things in general, and wanted to create an electrical car. But the very first time that you look at this, you think there's no practical way that anybody could use this. It's open to the elements, it's incredibly dangerous, it's right next to the wheels of cars that you'd be driving around. It has a minimal charge. It has no protection against the elements. There's nowhere to put shopping. I mean, it's horrible. It's you can't understand when you look at this why it was that a company could misunderstand their customers to that degree. Okay, so it's a case of when you look at the Mini, clearly they had a fundamental understanding. This was a serious vehicle. They made about 500 of them, most of which are in museums now as kind of joke pieces. But it just goes to demonstrate that even fairly successful organizations, if they don't have proper understanding of their customers or end users, the results can be pretty disastrous. And I would take that as learning for your Enactus groups. It's fundamentally about understanding the people that you're trying to serve. It's understanding them on a very on a deep level. It's not just understanding the market in general, but trying to understand the individual. Another example of perhaps not perfect empathy. This one is lovely. It's a very expensive house. It's made of concrete. It's a famous concrete build called the Falling Water by Frank Lloyd Wright, made for people who are very, very wealthy. And Frank Lloyd Wright clearly understood his market. This one, not quite as successful. It's a famous design icon by a French designer called Le Corbusier, who was famously interested in sort of brutalist concrete architecture. Perhaps not quite having as much empathy for the end user, however. It's a very difficult house to use. But unfortunately, that design ethos was taken up by a lot of architects who then start to develop things like this, which is where you think it's the same concept, concrete apartments for people to live in. However, this is beyond brutalist. It's something which just doesn't work fundamentally. It's basically, there are some housing blocks where people feel isolated from each other. Ironically, they're all living together, but they couldn't be more distant. And obviously some of these places tend to have crime problems because the density of living is too high. And you can also take people's pride away if you're dealing with things like this. If you're basically dealing with an apartment which is exactly the same as everybody else, and you have no personal commitment to the appearance of the property, then sometimes that can be problematic, you know. On the other hand, sometimes beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is a very famous building, which is very similar to the last two, and yet it's considered a classic building. It's in Berlin. It's called the Corbusier House. So sometimes it can be that you designed a building, you designed a product or a service or whatever with the end user in mind. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And yet it can be practically similar or practically identical in design. If you don't have empathy, if you don't have full understanding for the customer, though, there are sometimes some very funny and classic business cases that can come out of this. The most well-known that I usually talk about is the launch of Classic Coke in 1985, which if you go out and Google it, was a very interesting case study in a business disaster, where basically Coke realized that it was being trounced by Pepsi in the marketplace, decided to change their recipe. And what they did was they basically said, we want to create a Coke that would be more popular. They did taste tests. Lots of people said they preferred the new recipe that Coke was launching. And in the classic case of doing market research, that would have been very successful. However, when they actually launched the product, they found out that a lot of people were very committed to the former flavor of Coca-Cola. They saw it as being an American icon. And so a lot of people were outraged that Coke had changed its recipe. So fairly fundamental there, misunderstanding of what the customer actually wanted. Yes, the market research was telling you one thing, but it was very clear that if Coke had really gone and asked their customers, if they had got lots of them in rooms together and give them a long, proper conversation, they would have found out that there was a deeper connection to that particular product than was indicated by market research. Okay, the next stage. You want to try and define, after you've empathized with the customers or the end users that you think you have in mind, you need to have a definition for the people that you're actually going to reach to. The reason for this is very obvious. Is that, as you can see here, there are a lot of people potentially falling into the group that you would actually have dealing with a particular topic. So if you're planning on launching something and you're trying to be all things to all people, the chances are you won't be the best thing for any particular person. So unless you define who it is that you're actually reaching, you run the risk of being a jack of all trades and a master of none. You're being something which is potentially successful, but not successful in quite the scale that you would think and hope. So what do we do for narrowing down? Well, in the design thinking realm, and certainly in the software industry, this is a huge thing in the software industry, is that you have to create personas. Personas are basically trying to create an image of an individual that would be part of the group that you're looking at. So they want to have the characteristics of the group that you're talking to, but you're not trying to make it as broad as possible. You want them to be as close as possible to a real person. And the reason for that is very simple. Again, you can't really empathize unless you really know who it is that you're talking about. To give you an example, if you take the previous example of the Coca-Cola thing and the launch, well, if you had made a very generic sweeping statement about the market for Coca-Cola, you might have come up with something along the lines of Coca-Cola is drunk by people between the ages of 18 and 75. They tended to drink maybe at 3 different events, maybe at meals, maybe at sporting events and something. I mean, you would come up with some very broad sweeping statements that wouldn't necessarily help you. And it wouldn't come close to the ideas that were raised by the problems that they had, the idea that, you know, Coke was a classic icon. So only by understanding the individuals and understanding them to a degree of depth where perhaps if you had one person in mind, you could think of 10 or 15 characteristics of that person, only then would you truly start to appreciate what kind of impact your product, service, whatever, would actually have. Okay, so basically it enables you to create ideas that have a little bit more concrete aspect to them. They're a little bit more solid and they are likely to be more easily testable against a person that has a specific set of characteristics. You also have to define that person fairly in depth. When we're doing design workshops for large numbers of people, typically we'll do a session where maybe if it was like 3 hours long, maybe 1 hour we devoted to just doing the persona, in order that the people in the workshop would really get a fundamental understanding of the person that they were talking to or talking about. So you really have to sort of pick somebody who wouldn't necessarily be somebody that you would know. If it was somebody that you knew, then you run the potential problem of just putting in all of the characteristics of the person that you know. And unless all of the people in that workshop have a very broad and eclectic mix of individuals that they know, you run the risk of everybody basically creating the same persona or somebody that is very similar. And workshops that work best will have, if you have 10 workshops, right? You have one workshop with 10 groups, then each of the 10 groups will create a completely different character. So not just sort of male, female, but completely different educational backgrounds, likes, wants, desires, fears, hopes for the future, things that they want to achieve on a personal level, that sort of thing. The sort of thing where if you were to try and detail them and you try to imagine them, you'd imagine a real person. You wouldn't really imagine a series of bullet points. Just to throw this in there, because I know about what we do with Enactus, be wary of assigning characteristics to somebody that you think based on stereotypes. So one thing, for example, the idea that the homeless wouldn't play an instrument. Of course they would. You're dealing with real people. You're dealing with people that have got lots of different reasons for why they would be homeless. One of them could be that they were a musician and couldn't make a living as a musician. Who knows? But the point is that you have to always keep an open mind when you're actually dealing with human beings. This is one of the reasons why you do the exercises around empathy. It's trying to make the people as real in your mind as possible, because only when you're dealing with what you perceive as a real person can you come up with real solutions to their problems. As long as you're dealing with what you effectively see as bullet points on a slide, then you wouldn't necessarily build something that was actually genuinely useful for them. Next thing is ideation. Ideation is trying to come up with different methodologies for generating as many ideas as possible for dealing with a problem. Excuse me. Okay, so basically, if you have a single solution to a problem and you have perhaps somebody who is a very strong speaker in a room, and they have decided that there is one solution and one solution only, and it is their pet solution. What will happen is not only will you not get contributions from people that may have a lot of relevant expertise, and as I say, a lot of very eclectic ranges of expertise. So, the mathematician and the artist and the engineer and the doctor. If you have only one solution, you run the risk of just running straight past the real problem that the person that you're dealing with was having. You've built a solution to a problem which didn't exist potentially. So ideation is all about having as many ideas as possible. So it's basically you would write down, depending on which method you were using, as many ideas as the workshop group could possibly have. And the very notion that there's a limit should be thrown out. So if any idea, no matter how crazy at first it seems, because sometimes it's the left of center ideas, it's the completely off kilter ideas that are actually the ones that produce the best solutions. Okay, so basically what you want to do is have as many ideas as possible, and don't worry in the initial stage about organizing any of them. And to give you an idea of how this sort of was formalized sometimes in the past, before I go on to how the sort of the methods around actually how you generate ideas, is that there have been organizations that did that, and sometimes they can be a form of great inspiration. One in the nature of graphics and design and so on, for example, given that we're talking about design thinking, was the Bauhaus, which is an organization which I don't think it's operating now. It was closed down in the 1930s, but it was operating for about 30 years or so, and had a huge impact on design. And the reason it did is that basically they did this sort of ideation process. It was instead of basically just designing the same thing that was the solution to the problem that everybody had thought of, and basically creating the same solution over and over again, what they did was they tried to empathize with the people that had particular problems and thought, well, how do you solve the problem? On a fundamental level, one of the designers there used to think, well, what is a chair? What is a lamp? And it's interesting because you think, well, depending on how something is used, anything can be a chair. For example, a table could be a chair if you're sitting on it. So, sometimes it sounds a bit weird, but the point is that you're trying to sort of push the boundaries. If designers with some of this furniture now, some of which would be very modern looking now, remember this is from almost 100 years ago, at a time when people were still reclining in leather armchairs and using gas lamps. So the idea that they were building these things in the 1920s, it was pretty astonishing. So you have this sort of requirement to think about how do you have as many ideas as possible. how do you deliberately break the bounds of your conceptualization so that you're not constantly just reinventing the same thing or doing the same thing over and over again? And with regards to graphics, Bauhaus designers were also interested in graphic design. They took the same concepts of posters and navigation and so on, and completely upturned them. So they invented new fonts so that nobody was using the equivalent of Times New Roman all the time, which is what everybody was using. They even simple things like you see on the poster on the right hand side, things going from top left corner to bottom right hand corner, very, very simple. Why am I showing you these? Well, depending on what product or service or whatever you were designing, it may be that you can look at the same tools and the same concepts that have been used by people in the past, and without needing to change the resources, come up with a completely different way of using them. This is still, A4 paper and paint, but they came up with completely different radical solutions based on what it was that they thought the customers would want. And you can do the same thing with Enactus groups. There are lots of different ways of generating ideas. One of the things which is crucial in the ideation focus, or the ideation stage, is to try and come up with ideas or sort of processes for the creation of ideas that enable you to formally break boundaries, okay? Because sometimes it can be difficult to think creatively outside of your existing paradigm. So some of the ideas and some of the methodologies that we use in the software industry, the first one, for example, is mind mapping. Mind mapping is basically that you have one idea, you would place it in the center of the board, and then you would have a series of ideas that are connected to that single idea that result from or stem from that initial idea. So you have one, and then you'd end up with a cloud, maybe 3, 4, 5 different things that would stem from that. And then each one of those would necessarily have potentially another series of ideas that would stem from that. So you'd be sort of 2 steps removed from the initial idea. Some of the ideas that you would have would stop because it was clear that they weren't very good ideas. And maybe when you're doing your creative thinking, you can't think of an alternative, you can't think of the next step. So what happens is you end up with a map where there's clearly one particular direction or one flow. So you'd have the element would be in the middle, you'd have one connection, then it would stop. So that was clearly not a very good idea. But over here, you can go 7 steps in. So it's clear that that's actually a sort of rich vein for ideas. Another one is brainstorming. Brainstorming is the traditional method. It's simply listing down every single idea you have in no particular order. Storyboarding is quite useful in the software industry as well when we're talking about empathy with people, because if you're storyboarding an idea, it means that you're actually drawing something around their environment and about who they are and what they do. So if you're creating ideas that would be around, say if it was the chair, you could be, well, where would the chair be based? What materials would they have? This individual, how much money do they have? That kind of thing. So could they afford the sort of designs that you're creating? So storyboarding enables you to build a richer environment that enables you to understand the ideas better. Visual prompting is not something that I've done very often, but visual prompting is basically, imagine you have a series of cards. Sometimes it can be something as simple as having like trump cards. And what you would do is you make those cards photographs. Pinterest is a very good idea at the moment. And you make those available to individuals, and they would take that inspiration and then use those as a way of stimulating ideas. Because sometimes people are visually stimulated and therefore would actually be able to think more clearly if they actually had something to look at. As somebody who works with designers a lot, there's something called the tyranny of the blank page, which is that you can look at a blank page for as long as you like. You won't necessarily be able to generate ideas, but you're constantly thinking that you need to start. Whereas if you're given an image, if you're given an idea, ideas that stem from that often come more easily. Worst idea first is a little bit of a glib idea, but it does actually work, which is the idea that you put down what could not possibly happen, or what's the solution that would come with so many problems that it would be unfeasible. And you'd be surprised how many times you create an idea that you think is the worst idea, and actually it turns out to be the most effective. Okay. And the morphological analysis is basically you're breaking something down into its constituent components. So again, thinking about a chair has a certain amount of components to it. It has a metal frame, it has whatever the fabric is, it has whatever cushioning you're going to use. And what you would do then is that the ideas would stem from the individual components. And sometimes what you do is the ideas would stem from being able to think, well, what can we do differently? So the idea here, we've got transportation, becomes roads, wheels, propulsion, fuel, capacity, weight, the cost, etc. Well, you know, you can think about, well, what form of wheels would you have? You know, how would you provide wheels that would have greater traction for whatever reason, depending on where you are in the world? How can you make wheels that would last longer? How could you make wheels that wouldn't require rubber or any kind of vulcanization process? Or how would you make something that doesn't require plastics? Things of that sort of nature. So there's lots of ways to actually create ideas. And the idea is that basically through ideation, you deliberately try to have as many ideas as possible and don't narrow yourself right from the first word. Okay, so it's quantity or quality. This is a post-it note board because, frankly, when we're doing design thinking sessions, 99 times out of 100 will be in a design thinking session, and post-its will be the order of the day. So when we're doing physical spaces, obviously we can't do it quite the same way at the moment, although we will use various technologies to try and do virtual post-it notes. Sometimes that could be tricky because if you're dealing with 20 people and they're all creating ideas around post-its all on a board, then what can happen is the board can get very messy, rather like this, very quickly. But whereas with physical post-its on a whiteboard, you can move things around. It could be quite tricky to do that in a virtual sense, especially if you've got people all creating something at the same time. So the next stage after creating ideas is to organize them. Okay, so basically, if you had an idea, if there was a general theme that seemed to be emerging, or a series of themes, then what you would do is organize the post-its or organize the ideas into those themes. And that's why sometimes post-it notes are very useful, because you can move them around. If you were writing down, you know, on a poster or on a piece of A4 or something, it can be very, very tricky to actually change afterwards the location of the ideas. Whereas if you've got post-its, you could assign colors, you could put them on a table, you could draw a table with a pen on the whiteboard and actually organize the post-it notes into specific themes and topics. And if it turns out that you've got, say, 50 post-it notes that have been put up by 5 people, and 25 of those post-its all have the same theme or topic, the chances are it's probably quite a rich vein to explore with regards to solving a problem for people. The next stage is the prototyping stage. And what you do with prototyping is you're basically trying to narrow down the focus to something which you can actually physically test. By physically, I mean not necessarily literally building a physical prototype, though in a lot of workshops, we will sometimes have design thinking sessions where we literally ask people to take various craft materials and build a solution to a problem. So we'll give them pieces of paper and pipe cleaners and cardboard rolls and lots of other different things, you know, a dozen or so different resources, and ask them to go away and build a prototype. That works all right. Sometimes it can be a nice team building exercise. It's a lot of fun, but for your problems with Enactus, a lot of them will be building business concepts, or they're trying to develop really structural technologies and things that you're doing which wouldn't necessarily translate well into that kind of craft situation. So if you were, for example, you know, running a shop for a group of people, or if you were offering a service which revolved around giving advice, then it's difficult to prototype that in a physical sense. So sometimes it's better to just write down what the prototype is and what the characteristics are, and to have a sort of blueprint rather than to try and actually build something physical. But what it does do is it enables you to sort of narrow down the focus. With the ideas, if you can think of this as the inverted pyramid that you've got here. So basically, imagine you start off with, there are lots of ideas. Then you're organizing into groups, and what you'll find is that a certain subset of those ideas will form a sort of bedrock of a solution. So you'll find, as I say, you know, maybe a half or 1/3 or 1/4 of all the ideas relate to a particular thing. And then when you build the prototype is something that you would build to actually solve the problem related to that particular set of ideas. Okay, so the idea is maybe, if a lot of people, when they're running workshops now, will come up with an app idea. And top tip, don't always suggest an app to design thinking people, because a lot of people seem to think that apps will solve all problems. And I know one of the nice things about dealing with Enactus groups is that that doesn't tend to be the case, because I think you all have experience of running, proper businesses or proper organizations and entities that are helping people, and 99 times out of 100 that an app isn't going to work or isn't going to be relevant to that particular person, which is actually quite nice. But the idea is that you would build a prototype that would be specifically addressing some of the elements that you got from those ideas, or from the sub ideas, where it was clear that there was one theme emerging. The idea is that then you iterate. So the prototype itself, don't assume that it's going to be the last one, because the whole point of a prototype is to enter into the next stage, which is the testing phase. So you build a prototype literally to build it to destruction. So the idea is that basically you build a prototype and then you give it to a group of people who might be people on your team. It could be people from other teams, could be people from other organizations that are related to the thing that you're doing, the business that you're in, or the entity that you're running. And then what you do then is you ask them to poke holes in it, and also to tell you what's good about it. Because it's not always about sort of testing to destruction. Sometimes you can find out that you've got an idea which works at solving one problem that was a problem that you hadn't even thought was a problem initially in the first place. But the whole point is that you might try and make it as simple as possible. So don't build prototypes that are overly complex, because the whole point is that you're trying to test a particular concept, not trying to test a finished product. A lot of the times when we're developing software, especially things at the moment like usability and user experience, we will not develop an app or a piece of software or something which requires potentially thousands of hours of work in development, and going down the route of building something which costs, €1 million to develop, when a piece of paper with a picture on would have been just as effective. So don't oversimplify things, don't overthink or overcomplicate things. Sometimes all you need to do is show somebody the thing which represents the prototype, and you will get feedback which would be useful, meaning that you would be able to develop perhaps several generations of an idea before you've even started building anything. There's a colleague of mine that basically says that building software is expensive, it's time consuming, it requires a lot of organization, and it can be very expensive to throw away, and very disheartening. So sometimes creating a picture is far more effective. And testing is the idea that basically you define what the prototype is, and then, as I say, you try to formally identify all the various things that are good and bad about it. So literally, as the tick box here, it's almost like a quality audit. So you'd ask for individuals to actually look at the problems and the potential benefits from the prototype, and actually give you a formal response. So not just, oh, that looks good. It has to be really specific. It has to be that, no, this doesn't work because people with poor eyesight wouldn't be able to use it. The colorblind wouldn't be able to use it. People with limited mobility wouldn't be able to use it. Whatever the issues that you've got facing the thing that you've built, try to be specific, because it's only in trying to then resolve the specific problem that your prototype can actually develop and become something more. If it's just, oh, that's quite good, I like it, but maybe not quite so much, and it's very vague, you've got nothing to work with. And that means that you can't actually change anything, because you don't know what it is that needs changing. But what you should do is be aware that testing and prototyping, as I say, it's an iterative loop. You shouldn't basically look at a prototype and say, well, that's the end product. Eventually, it might be the end product, but even if it's the end product, it's probably only the end product for that particular generation. It's not the end product overall, because things keep changing over time, especially in the technology industry, but especially also with your entities, the organizations that you run through Enactus, because different problems, different technologies, different products will emerge, that might make the thing that you thought was the solution yesterday much more viable tomorrow, or completely unviable or inviable. So, you know, it may be that something else comes along, which is a technology or a technique or some funding or some government intervention or something which comes along, and you're able to take advantage of that, which makes another solution far more viable than it was. And a good idea of how things change over time is that a lot of these, I'm showing you a couple of GUIs here for people who would be aware of the software industry. These are the world's first graphical user interfaces, effectively the first Windows or the first Macs. So the one on the top right is the Xerox Star from Xerox PARC in the 1970s, early 1970s, which Steve Jobs saw when he did a tour of Xerox PARC in the mid 1970s. He went away and asked his people to design, eventually in 1980, 81, the Macintosh, the operating system for the Macintosh, which is the one that you see at the bottom. So that's the graphical user interface, which is off the first Macintosh from 40 years ago, which led to, of course, things like the iPad. Okay. So the very first iMac, also a very good example of this. This is mid 1990s, considered, rightfully a design classic. But if they had stopped and said, well, this is the end product, then you would never have had the iPad in the bottom right-hand corner. And crucially, you would also not have had all of the technologies which are reliant upon the infrastructure which things like Apple were able to build. So the fact that you were able to go on things like the Apple Store and purchase and install a whole battery of different pieces of software mean that you can now create effectively your own environment on your computer, whichever computer you want, which happen to use, whether it's a tablet or a laptop or a desktop. So that degree of evolution has meant that at no point over the last 40 years, despite how amazing the technologies were and how popular they were and how they were seen as cutting edge, they weren't the final product. And it's probably to say in a lot of cases, especially in the technology industry, that there'll never be a final product, that there'll always be the next thing, that this product was a rung on the a rung on the ladder to something else. There may be some alternatives. There may be some things which are always the same, a ball maybe, or a book. But even then you could say, well, there's always alternatives to books. Go and tell people about things like Kindle and so on 30 years ago, they would have looked at you like you were crazy because I had no idea what that concept was. So there you go. And not all concepts will survive impact with the real world. So that's something else that you need to bear in mind. Way back in the 1920s, the future of aviation and the future of personal travel was going to be aircraft. Everybody was obsessed with aircraft. So all the prototypes that they were building were based around that. And they even built, you think, the bottom right-hand corner, that's from a film called Metropolis, classic film, I think Fritz Lang in the 1930s, or 1920s even. And basically the idea was that people would be living in huge skyscrapers, turned out to be the case in lots of cities, that there would be lots of personal aircraft around. Yes, but not quite as many as they thought. And the idea was that people would use aircraft to travel from A to B. Usually when I'm doing a face-to-face workshop, I will ask people what the tower at the top of the Empire State Building was designed for. And people like Andrew already know what the answer to this is because they've been in several workshops. But I'll give you a couple of seconds just to think about it. But the tower, by the tower, I mean, if you can see my screen on my mouse, this little bit here, right at the top, that used to be the top of the building. And the tower, this telecom thing on top, was not. That was not part of the original design. That was something which was added on later. So why do they have this thing? It's basically it's an observation room, but it has doors going outside. You think, why on earth would an observation room? They've been closed off, by the way, since there are not doors on the top of the Empire State Building anymore that lead straight to your doom. But 100 years ago, or 80 or 90 years ago, they were, because it was designed for this. It was literally designed for airships. And the idea was that, as you can see, those people that are putting their lives in their hands on the right-hand side there, literally climbing across a gangway at the top of the Empire State Building, a gangway which is only 2 or 3 feet wide and which only has one railing, to climb into an airship, which, by the way, remember, is doing this because it's being buffeted by the winds at the top of the Empire State Building. Interesting experience. And these were people who were basically paying first-class tickets. So you think the entire process that led to that, if they had some degree of empathy, so maybe they understood their customers very well, they understood the technology that was around at the time, they were led to believe that airships would be the future of air travel. They had done a prototyping process. Perhaps they had multiple models of little Empire State Buildings on desks in architects' offices. And they come up with ideas for why that had actually been the case, and why it was going to be a huge success. And of course it wasn't. It was never used. I think it was used something like half a dozen times, I think. And of course, the fact that people started to go on powered flight, and there were several airports in New York. Actually, at this time, there were over a dozen airports in New York. But now there's LaGuardia and JFK and so on. So it never turned out to be the thing that they thought it was going to be, despite the fact that they followed the entire process. So you always have to have a certain degree of humility when it comes to design. Another one which could reveal literally fatal flaws in design is the Comet, which is the world's first jet airliner. And again, they went through all the steps that I just talked about. So they came up with ideas of who the key passengers would be. They knew what technologies were around. They came up with ideas for how to combine all the various technologies into an aircraft that would be a jet aircraft. They developed prototypes, lots of prototypes. And these airliners flew successfully for half a dozen years before they developed problems. And the problem was that the top of the aircraft basically flew off mid-flight. So literally about the scariest thing that you could imagine would happen, being in an air. Imagine being at 35,000 feet and the top of the plane comes off. I can't think of a worse fate. And so, yeah, there's several of these planes crashed. And it turned out the problem was that they were using square windows. Very, very, very simple. No, literally, there was nothing wrong with the rest of the aircraft. The reason that there was a problem was because square windows, because of engineering problems, because of the faults that develop in the corners of the windows far more easily than would happen with a circular window, which is why all windows now are sort of elliptical. The corners would basically put greater stress on the body of the aircraft, and so these fissures would appear. And once the fissure appears, within literally minutes, the force of wind acting upon the fissure would basically turn what was a crack into a gap, as you've seen there. You can see basically this is a whole big split in the side. So again, this is just something again to bear in mind of the design thinking process. You can have the best of intentions, but it's entirely possible that you miss something. And sometimes the testing phase and the rebuilding and prototyping in order to deal with the problem is something which can literally last years. Now, I don't expect you guys, obviously, with Enactus to be building things that would take years to iterate. However, I would say that it's worth just always having a certain degree of humility and bearing in mind that maybe the solution that you're currently going with could be working pretty well. But it's always worth bearing in mind that there could be a better way. And that having an ideation process, having prototyping, having room for testing, and then basically testing your ideas and willing to try new things will often help you resolve issues before they turn into the sort of things that we've got here. To make sure that your ideas are current, up to date, exciting, that they actually solve the problem, and that as technologies change, people change, environments, governments, all these things are in flux, that whatever solutions you have today are not necessarily the most appropriate for the solutions that you have for tomorrow. And with that, I am going to conclude the presentation. Are there any questions at all?
Claire?
Yes, so I think we've been fielding a couple of the questions in the chat as we've been going along, Martin, but I'm sure that there are definitely some contributions for yourself here. So one of the questions that we received was regarding testing and whether it is more beneficial to test with a smaller group first or a larger group. So I think it'd be really interesting to kind of get your insight on that.
Okay. I think initially a small group, especially in the early stages, because if you're dealing with potentially the situation where you'd have multiple prototypes, especially if you're dealing with something which is very conceptual, then it helps to get kind of really in-depth feedback from a small number. If you, for example, I mean, I know if we were dealing with again, a software example, and you were dealing with this thing that I mentioned earlier, where you would do something on a piece of paper first instead of building a whole app. Then if you get a piece of paper and it has the entire prototype on it, and you go to, say, 10 people, they could probably work through a whole series of, especially if you're, specialists, you'd be able to get an awful lot of feedback in a very short space of time. If you went to a lot of people, either you'd be dealing with a lot of people that wouldn't necessarily have that same range of expertise, so they'd give you results that were necessarily fairly broad or fairly shallow, or you would struggle to collate all of the results unless you've got some sort of really formal survey process and can capture all the information, you do all the data mining, all that kind of thing. So initially, I would say usually start with a fairly small group, a group of people that you know are going to be highly responsive, that are going to give you really good feedback, feedback which is really useful. And then if you want to go to the next stage, then you would go to a broader group, but then you'd have to have more of a sort of formal response.
Great, thank you. Okay. We had another question in the chat, which I think it might be really useful to get another perspective on. So the question says, should we focus more on continuously improving and developing our existing projects, or if we feel they have a lot of potential, or should we focus on creating new projects?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it really kind of depends on your circumstances. I mean, if you feel from your sort of day-to-day interactions with the people that you're trying to help that there is a problem that they have, or multiple problems that they have, and what you're doing is either only helping them to a limited degree, or I mean, I can't imagine there'd be a situation where you have an actors group that wasn't helping anybody at all. So the chances are it's that you're helping, but they have some additional issues that you can't touch on. It may be that you would need to look at, a fresh approach. But at the same time, I would say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The chances are that if you've built something and there's an actors group or an actors organization or an entity which has been running for like 5, 6, 7 years, the chances are there's a demand for the services that entity is doing. So I would say, as a first stab, try to improve the thing that you're doing currently. But if you really do like have really good understanding of the person that you're talking to, or the people that you're talking to, and it's clear that whatever it is you're doing will only ever solve a certain percentage or a certain proportion of what their problems are, then don't be frightened about thinking about new ideas. We do have a sort of tendency to think that the old way is always the best way, and things may have changed in environments to the degree that a new solution is warranted and would be better. It's just that nobody's ever thought of a new solution because nobody's ever put the time into it.
Yeah, definitely. I think we might have time for just one more question, which has just popped up in the chat, which we haven't answered yet. So this is kind of asking for more information about how SAP generates ideas for software development and the needs assessment of end users.
Oh, blimey. Okay. And can I answer that in 2 minutes? I would say I could provide the Enactus team with a series of links. I think it's probably the best way for me to do that. I can provide links to some of the design thinking resources that we have, because that's not sort of thing. That's the sort of thing I could do an entire presentation of an hour long just on that topic. So I think on that thing, if I provide a whole bunch of links to interesting speakers and to things on, you know, our conferences at Sapphire and so on, where we have lots of speakers on those topics, you can go on there and watch YouTube videos to your heart's content.
Okay. Well, I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions, although I imagine students may have more, and if we receive any more through, we will of course share those across to you. Sure. It was such an insightful session, and I think it's really good to kind of get kind of more detail on that process of empathize, define, ideate, prototype and test. And some of the students who maybe were with us yesterday might have noticed that we are building that design thinking process into summer action this year, and just kind of taking that kind of methodology through. So certainly something to look out for. Another thing I just wanted to highlight as well is if you wanted to kind of explore further the practical application of design thinking and what Martin's been able to share with us today, check out the Beggar to Busker case study, which we've included in the pre-work. So you might have been sent in advance some slides which had an example. So this will really kind of help you put it into context. And if you don't have that for any reason, do just reach out to myself or one of my colleagues, and we will be able to share that across. It's also really great to see how the different sessions start linking together. One quote I took a little note of was, a lack of empathy can result in a disastrous response to your design. This is something we have seen previously, where students will go away with all the best intentions, start developing their idea, but without having yet contacted the community and saying, is this what you really want? Is this really your biggest issue? And had sat down and maybe had a couple of cups of tea with the beneficiaries themselves and started to really understand it from their perspective. So it's just really, really invaluable. So just really wanted to thank you, Martin, so much for giving up your time today and for delivering the session on design thinking.
Oh, had a lot of fun. Many thanks for inviting me.